Okay, welcome to lesson 1 on topic 5. This is the first lesson in the new topic. The new topic really centers around the question of how effectively or how well did the United States contain the spread of communism, live up to the goal of containment as set by the Truman Doctrine. In other words, were the U.S. effective in their interventions in countries that were threatened by communist takeover? The topic here really looks at 3 different case studies. The first one being the Korean War, the second one being the Vietnam War, and the third one being the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963. This topic is the first, or this lesson rather, is the first of a few on the Korean War, where we sort of study that war, study the sort of how it develops and what ultimately are the results. And we kind of use the Korean War as a lens to come to a judgment of whether or not the United States in this overall policy of containment was successful. Now, the United Nations is formed, much like the League of Nations, in the wake of a large world war. The United Nations is really the son or daughter of the League of Nations. When the League of Nations failed, the United Nations put the principles of the League of Nations into a more global, palatable, and stronger package, and was meant to be, like the League of Nations, an international police force. And the major difference with the League of Nations and the United Nations is the fact that the United Nations is centered around the United States. And unlike the situation after the First World War, after the Second World War, you have as members of the Security Council, especially permanent members, the big players, the United States and Russia. It was a joint organization where both the Soviets and the U.S. effectively participated. Though the United Nations has been around since 1945, there's only really been one time that the UN has authorized the use of extreme force to restore international peace and security, and this was in the Korean Peninsula, based on events between 1950 and 1953. And the Article 42 of the Charter of the United Nations, the rules or the Constitution of the United Nations, very similar to the Covenant of the League of Nations, really says that if the Security Council, the group, each country has a member on the Security Council, if the Security Council meets and says that if it's necessary to maintain and restore international peace and security, the United Nations would basically take on military operations against an aggressive power. Now, what was the situation in Korea, and why is Korea the only example of the United Nations taking aggressive action here in its existence? And we're talking about the difference between actual full-on war and peacekeeping. The United Nations has played an active role in peacekeeping for the last several decades, and you're probably familiar with United peacekeeping operations all around the world, many of which have included the British Army. Now, these aren't all out war. These people are supposed to be intermediaries between two warring powers. In Korea, it is actually a war. So what was the situation? Well, Korea, as a country, had existed somewhat all the way through, I suppose, the Middle Ages and the Asian sort of Middle Ages, if you will. But from 1910 onwards, it was dominated by the largest and most powerful country in Asia at that particular point, the Empire of Japan, which uses the period between 1905 and 1941 to expand quite rapidly. You're probably familiar with the war in the Pacific and across the islands that separate the United States and the Empire of Japan. But what a lot of people don't realize is the extent of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Empire had a huge, large land empire that included countries like Vietnam today, that included Cambodia, that included the Koreas and large parts of China. After the war, because Japan had fought with Germany on the Axis side, the Allies, the Soviets and the Americans, cooperated in the Pacific, though the Americans do the brunt of the fighting, like they had in Europe. And in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula was liberated by the Soviet troops, and the southern half by American troops. And a dividing line between the two of them was drawn at the 38th parallel, or line of latitude that splits the Korean Peninsula roughly in two. And, in Asia, in this particular case, in Korea, what played out in Europe plays out very, very similarly. And the agreements are basically the same, and how the relationship falls apart is almost exactly the same. The United Nations, of course, steps in and calls for free elections to be held nationwide in the Soviet zone and in the American zone, and for a democratic government for the whole of Korea to be set up. But as I said, as in Europe, the United States zone, of course, allows free elections. And the Republic of Korea is set up in the zone run by the United States, and it's led by a man named Syngman Rhee, and its capital is the capital of Korea today, that is Seoul. In the Soviet zone in the north, there are no free elections, and of course, a communist country is established called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and this is led by one of the key leading Korean military officers who fought against the Japanese, a man named Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of today's Kim Jong-un. And its capital, like the North Korean capital is today, was held at Pyongyang. And to give you an idea how this breaks down, it basically breaks down like this. Underneath the Korean flag is where Seoul is, and rather the South Korean flag is where Seoul is, and the North Korean flag is basically where Pyongyang is. And you see the influence of the Soviets and the Americans in their respective sides, dividing this peninsula that makes up modern Korea basically right in half. Now, who is Kim Il-sung? He's a very important character, apart from being the grandfather of the much maligned, much talked about, incredibly dangerous leader of North Korea today. He is a hardcore communist, and very much in the mold of Mao Zedong, leads a revolution in North Korea, to establish a communist dictatorship. And by 1950s, he believes that he is in power, or in a position in the 1950s, to invade South Korea and unify all of the Koreas under communism. Now, why did he think he would be able to do this, especially against a power in South Korea that was supported by the United States? First and foremost, it was 2-1. China had, in 1949, become communist, and it had its own similar communist revolution, and that had been supported by the Soviet Union, and it was led by a man named Mao Zedong, who establishes China as a very important force in Asia again. And Mao, of course, is more than happy to... The other person, of course, that supports Kim Il-sung is Stalin, who we know in a position in the late 1940s and 1950s to be extremely powerful. The second region, so basically he says, okay, I've got two giant powers against one, the United States. This puts me in a good position. Secondly, of course, North Korea's armed forces were incredibly well equipped by the Soviets. They had tanks, heavy artillery, and planes, and they were much stronger than anything the Southern Koreans had at this particular time, leaving South Korea incredibly vulnerable. The United States, of course, had focused most of their attention on Europe and ignored the Koreas to the detriment of the South Korean position at this particular point. Also, too, Kim took advantage of international events. Many of you have probably wondered, when did the Russians get the bomb? Well, they got that in 1949, and that really balances the playing field. The United States, being the bully boy of the world because they have the bomb in their back pocket, is effectively eliminated from 1949. And because he had the support of the USSR and China, and because the USSR had the atomic bomb, he basically felt that the USA would have no intention of intervening in what he would consider an inconsequential war in the Korean Peninsula. And also, too, of course, he's listening very closely. Intelligence and U.S. media is being taken back to North Korea, and American politicians who sort of sense that there may be potential problems in Korea are starting to say things like perhaps that Korea isn't a priority of the United States. And he starts to believe that if he were to invade the South, it would probably lead to a quick and easy victory, and as such, he invades the South on the 25th of June, 1950. Now, the reaction of the UN is as swift and as direct as at any time in its existence. The Security Council, the council who meets to decide, there are many councils in the United Nations. They're looking at different problems in the world. The Security Council looks at military intervention, and anytime there's sort of an attack on another country, it's the Security Council whose plate this attack falls on top of. And the Security Council meets on the same day as the invasion, and they pass a resolution calling for an end to hostilities, and that's UN Council Resolution number 82. You can read it there on the right. It's important to note, however, that the resolution would not have been passed had the Soviet Union been in attendance. Of course, the key members of the Security Council, the Great Britain, Soviet Union, and the United States, have a veto. And if one of those countries, any one of those countries, disagree, they can veto and nothing will happen whatsoever. However, one of the reasons that the Americans are able to act so effectively here, and why the UN is able to act so effectively, is that the Soviets were abstaining. In other words, they were not sitting in the UN, they were protesting. The Americans had refused to allow Communist China into the UN in 1949, and as a result, the Soviets basically had a hissy fit and say that we will not participate in the UN, we'll undermine this organization by our not being there. And as a result, the United States is actually able to intervene in Korea, because otherwise the Soviets would have vetoed it to allow the North Koreans, of course, to move into South Korea even more unopposed than they already do. And it would have forced the Americans probably to act alone. But as a result, they don't have to. So UN Security Council Resolution 82 requests effectively that the North Koreans back down and withdraw above the 38th parallel. It sort of sets a line, and if they don't go back on this line, well, then perhaps stuff will happen. When the Soviet-backed Korean forces, that should read, won't leave, the UN Security Council meets again, and this is approximately 10 days later. And they pass two more resolutions. The first one is a few days later, and the second one is 10 days later. They pass two more resolutions. Basically, the 27th of June resolution says that we will use force if international peace and security is not restored in the area. In other words, if the Koreans don't back down. And then when they don't back down by July 7th, when the North Korean invasion of the South continues, that basically it calls for all members of the United Nations to provide military forces to help the Republic of South Korea defend against the aggressors from the north. These forces would be put under the command of the United States. Countries that took place include Australia, Belgium, Britain, the great and powerful nation of Canada, Colombia, France, Greece, nationalist China, I'll explain that in a sec, Netherlands, New Zealand, Panama, Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, South Africa. And all of these countries sent actually some very large contingents of soldiers to fight together under the command of the United States against the North Koreans, supported and backed by the Soviets, and more particularly the Chinese. Just an interesting point, because it'll be referenced to something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. China, as I said, had a revolution, and that revolution was between them, the nationalists, led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, who wanted to set up basically, let's say, an authoritarian dictatorship-like country, but still very much a country that was not communist, expressively so, and sort of at least friendly with the United States, against the Soviet-backed communist rebels led by Mao Zedong. And of course, we know by 1949, Mao wins. The nationalist forces run away. And they run away, actually, to an island off the coast of China known as Taiwan. At that particular point, it's called Formosa, because it was an island very much dominated by the British and their trading interests. The Americans had trading interests there, too. And the nationalists, Chinese, the Taiwanese, it's actually kind of an interesting relationship today. Technically, Taiwan is part of China, but because of the historic tensions, China and Taiwan have sort of an interesting sharing power relationship where China exerts control over Taiwan, but Taiwan remains a degree independent. Mostly that's because the nationalists had gone there, and they remained relatively strong. Over time, the Taiwanese become more and more closely interlinked with China, but at that particular time, it was an independent nation. It was actually part of the UN. It was backed by the Soviet Union and the Great Britain, and the British, and was something entirely different. And as such, because of the nature of Chinese support for the North and the communist spread, it's only natural that the Chinese nationalists, the nationalist Chinese of Taiwan, get involved there at that particular time. Now, what was the attitude of the USA to the invasion of South Korea? One of the last things I want to talk about is that you have to understand that the United States sees Asia as a very, very important pawn, if you will, in this Cold War chess game. Of course, they had really been closely associated with the establishment of the Southern Republic of Korea, and they wanted to protect that. Number two, of course, according to the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment, they're pretty determined that any further communist aggression, whether it be in Europe or worldwide, would be checked by American interests. And they also saw that world communism was a big threat. The Americans start to envision, and very much in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there's a Red Scare. Americans fully believe that the communists are bent on taking over the entire world. And it's the Americans who must stop this aggressive, horrible communist intrusion on the world. And they see world communism as a single force directed by Moscow, led by organizations such as Cominform, that is trying to take over the world. And they really see that the policy of containment needs to be spread not only to Europe, but all over the world to prevent this from happening. And very importantly, they believed in what was sort of a notion of domino theory. In other words, if South Korea fell, then what would be next? The communists would feel that they could get away with anything. They could push the Americans and the UN around. Would they take Formosa or Taiwan next, where the nationalists were held? And if they took Taiwan, well, what would the position of Japan be? What would happen if Japan was threatened by communism? The Americans saw, looking down the road, saw that if South Korea fell, other countries in the region would fall. Perhaps, as we'll learn later, Vietnam would be one of these countries. And like dominoes, they would fall over one by one. And if Asia fell to the communists, then certainly the balance of power, in other words, how many countries and how many people were in fact controlled by communism, would be much more in favor of the communists than would be the capitalist Americans, and the Americans would be losing the Cold War. So they thought, we have to make a stand right here. They wouldn't let these fall. They wouldn't let the balance of power fall in favor of the communists. And right now the balance of power is basically shared in two. So the American position is this. They felt that the most effective way to prevent such a shift in the balance of power was to make a strong stand in Korea and oppose communist aggression. It's important to note probably that if, let's say, the Russians had been sitting on the Security Council that day and the UN didn't get involved, there's almost no doubt whatsoever the Americans would have gone into Korea and acted on their own. They had to stop this. They knew that. And therefore, they were actually quite fortunate that the UN was able to act because of the absence of the Russians. And the UN action against the North Korean invasion is overwhelming. It's probably the most concerted, coordinated time the UN has ever worked together. The United States forces are put under the command of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, who was an American general in the Second World War, who was responsible for liberation of a lot of these areas, including South Korea, the Philippines, during the Second World War against Japan. And he's given the command of the United States forces again in Korea because of his knowledge of the region. Nobody else, perhaps in the world, knows how to fight in these particular areas as well as MacArthur. Therefore, it just totally makes sense. And anyways, the UN forces are put under American command. Half the ground forces are Americans, and this sort of UN contingent that goes to Korea is very much overwhelmingly American in character. 90% of the air forces that are flying over the skies of Korea fighting against the Chinese and the North Korean air forces are that of the Americans. 85% of the naval forces that are sent to Korea, be it in terms of battleships or aircraft carriers that enforce a blockade of the Korean peninsula and provide air support and firepower support to the troops on the land. 85% of these naval forces are all controlled by Americans. So we see that at the end of this lesson, the situation in Korea is very much poised to become quite a big conflict. And the Korean War in and of itself is often misunderstood and often underappreciated. But it's a tremendously large conflict, and its results are still with us today. That, of course, is a subject for later lessons.